This is the Tory Leadership Election podcast, brought to you by Conservative Home.
Hello and welcome to this, the third edition of the Conservative Home Tory Leadership Election podcast. I am Henry Hill, Deputy Editor, and joining me today is, in his usual place, William Atkinson, our Assistant Editor, and our Conhome comrade and noted Boris Johnson biographer, Andrew Jimson, whom you may know from his wonderful sketches that he has had cause to write surfeit of in the last few weeks. So we will, in Paul's absence, be following the usual format. First of all, William will take us through the week ahead. Then all three of us will discuss what's been going on in the broadest sense. And then, of course, at the end, William will come back and he will give you his official scores on who's had a good week and who's had a bad week. So, without further ado, William, what lies before us this week?
Well, over the next week, we have the first, should we say, it's a foray into the direct head-to-head between Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss, the final two candidates, as they begin travelling up and down the country to try and impress the membership, who will ultimately decide who our next leader will be and who our next Prime Minister will be. So next week, we've got our first hustings, which is in Liz Truss's old stomping ground of Leeds. As well as that, before that, we've got a debate on the BBC on the 25th of August. And this is all ahead of the first ballots coming out on the 1st of August. Sorry, the 25th of July, I should say.
Perfect. So, what's even happened this week? This is the problem. There's been so much news, the sheer onslaught of news, that you rather end up losing track of what's happened when. But we do know one important thing that's happened, which is that we've got down to the final two. So, Andrew, is this the final two that you were expecting, or did you think that something else might happen?
I've been wrong at every stage. I've been a contraindicator. I thought Nadeem Zahabi would do well in this, and he didn't, of course. And then I certainly, in common with many Conservatives, I have a very high opinion of Kemi Badenoch, and I hope that she would perhaps pick up momentum and come through. And again, that did not happen.
No, I think this is maybe the first Tory leadership election I can think of where the two people who got through to the final round are the two people everyone was talking about at the beginning. I can't tell whether this is just because Rishi, relatively speaking, had quite a weak first place start and therefore didn't have the votes to play silly buggers in the final round. But this is, there's no Andrea Leadsom figure here or anyone like that. Everyone before the election, you'd have said, who are the two front runners? Probably Rishi and Liz, and here we are. And I can't remember another time that's happened.
Very determined efforts and successful efforts were made to sink Penny Mordaunt. And ludicrous bits were quoted from her book and all that sort of thing. She was regarded as a real threat, I think.
Well, I was going to say, I'm aware that I'm dealing with an author, but if there are ludicrous bits in your book to quote,
Yes.
then are you being smeared?
Yes. I see. No, I wouldn't use the word smear.
Okay.
Certainly.
No, there was
certainly accused of having unsound views on a wide range of topics.
Well, indeed, and I think we should mention only in passing that in the last episode of this podcast, Paul and I differed on who would get through to the final two, and Paul suggested it would be Penny, and that's the last word that we're going to say on that subject.
We're just
going to let the waters close over it.
No. The editor is as near to omniscience.
Absolutely, he very graciously affords
he was just stimulating debate. I think
we junior staff an opportunity to shine, and we're very grateful. So, what do we think of the race? Who let's put our cards on the table now. From where we stand, we've obviously got a month and a bit to go, but from where we stand, who do we think is going to win? And why?
I think Liz is probably going to win because I just think that she...
Bad news for Liz Truss, as contraindicator Andrew Jimson weighs in once again.
I just think that she makes people feel good about being Conservative, possibly in a more dynamic way than Rishi does. If I had a vote, I would vote for Rishi, actually. So,
if you had a vote, are you not a Conservative?
I'm not a member of the party. I've never been a member of any party.
Well, we'll remove that voting, so that's fine.
I'm probably too conservative to belong to.
So my hunch is basically that Liz is obviously ahead. From all the evidence we've got, Liz is ahead with the membership now. Not hard to see why, really. Rishi, for perfectly sound Conservative reasons, is running as a high-tax candidate, which is not a winning proposition if the selectorate consists of Conservative Party members. But my suspicion is that if we had a long race and members didn't vote until, say, near the end of next month, Rishi could probably close the gap, because I just think that from what we've seen so far, he's a much more assured campaigner. And I think that ultimately he could probably establish in the minds of the membership that, for better or worse, he is probably the one who can deliver in 2024. The danger, obviously, for him is that the party's going to let people start voting on William. William will give us the date, but was it next week?
1st of August.
1st of August. So
Let's go out, I think, yeah.
So members are going to be able to vote very early. And therefore, this early advantage for Liz Truss, even if she does end up having a diabolical campaign,
Yes.
could just get baked in.
Yes.
I mean, does that?
Although people can change their minds, can't they?
Oh, well, I mean, we're going to come to the 1922's commitment to chaos by allowing people to vote twice. But I mean, does that tally with you? Do you think if Rishi did have, say, a month before people could vote, do you reckon he might be able to close the gap, or do you reckon it's a lock on?
There are a great many people who do want to look at both of them quite carefully. And Rishi is a man of formidable ability. I mean, there's no doubt about that. He's succeeded at everything he's ever done, really. He's a prodigy.
Gosh. Is this your next book?
No, I don't think so. Although I am very interested. I think the whole phenomenon, actually, of the compatibility between a certain kind of Hindu Asian voter, or indeed now MP, the fact that the party did so well in Harrow, for example, which has a third of the voters there of British Indian descent. That's very interesting, I think, and I would like to know more about why this is, actually, because I don't really know anything very much about Hinduism or why. But obviously, there's a tremendous spirit of enterprise.
Well, it
also a tremendous spirit of sort of community and helping people.
It also has quite a long pedigree. I think that the first ethnic minority Conservative MP was Samantaji Bownagree, who was returned under Lord Salisbury.
Yes, about 1893 or something like that. Yes,
so beaten only by the Liberals, but beating Labour happily, as we so often do on this particular metric. Yes. So anyway, let's touch on this very strange decision. I think it might be William on this as well, because it just seems to me to be a recipe for chaos. Basically, the 1922 has said that the party's going to allow people to vote twice, and you get a postal ballot and an online ballot. And if you change your mind, having cast one or the other, you can send in the second one, and only the second one will count. Now, you can see how this has arisen as an attempt to split the difference between getting the ballots open early to try and maximise turnout and encouraging people to vote late so they take a considered view of the candidates. But I'd be interested in your views on this, because it seems to me this is a recipe for chaos, because it's one thing to say, assuming everyone voted, it's one thing to say count 160,000 ballots. But it is an entirely different thing to file 160,000 ballots and then cross-reference them with online ballots. Because presumably you'll have like a code or something or your membership number. And I'm imagining some poor 20-something in CCHQ receiving an online vote from membership number whatever, and then having to check whether or not there's been a paper ballot that matches it. And it just seems to me that this is something that could go quite badly wrong.
William is much more likely to know than I, whether this is technically, in fact, quite easy.
Well, I think the problem that Henry has identified there is that it's the fact that they're trying to run simultaneously a paper election alongside an online election. I mean, clearly the party's got used to, over the last couple of years, doing more events online, etc., ticketing for more things online, etc. But then trying to combine that with trying to do a leadership election in the traditional format, as Henry says, it's probably a recipe for chaos. And I can understand why they've done it, and I can understand why they want to give people the opportunity to vote again, etc., as a way to sort of counter claims that because they're trying to do the actual voting stage so early, that it renders all the rest of the hustings pointless, which they've organised. But at the same time, to actually try and combine that with, I think research suggested previous ballots, people have filed up to about 50% of all the ballots almost immediately once they received them. So already, we're at a stage where people will be making up their minds based on what we see in only 1 week of actual competition between Liz and Rishi directly. And so as a consequence of that, trying to counteract this problem, for want of a better phrase, of people voting early by allowing them to vote more often. And as you say, voting both online and on paper is, I think, simply a recipe for chaos. And God knows what it will then actually create in terms of a result, but also will it create grounds for either camp if it's a particularly narrow result, that we get on the 5th of September to actually challenge it, because they can say, well, hang on, are you giving the same weight to people who voted on paper as you are online? Is there not the potential for a technical flaw, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? And even if it's all entirely above board, as I'm sure every effort will be made to make sure it is, there might still be grounds for any sort of technical issue to challenge that. And that is not a very good place to be in when you're selecting, fundamentally, the next Prime Minister of the United Kingdom.
Maybe this will be the first TCHQ IT project delivered at pace, on budget, and without flaws. We can live in hope. What do we think the impact of these hustings is going to be? There's going to be 12, as I understand it, one in each of the English regions, plus Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. Now, my patch is obviously Northern Ireland, and I think it could potentially be absolutely fascinating because we've got about 5 members, so I don't know who they're going to invite to fill the room.
Yes.
But obviously, it's going to put both candidates' position on the protocol under the microscope in a way that they might rather avoid, especially given that the EU has announced today that they're starting enforcement proceedings against the UK. So that could be very interesting. But do we think that currently in the MP stage of the debate, the debate was very much focused on tax cuts and woke issues to an extent, Penny Mordaunt's opinions on things. Do we think that once we get out to the member stage and the MPs are touring the country, do we think the emphasis is going to change? What issues do you think the members might press them on?
Well, an element of drama was introduced into the last race because Boris and Carrie had some row about red wine and the sofa and all that, and not much more than 24 hours later, it was the first hustings in Birmingham. And so that was the story. And Ian Dale, who chaired those hustings, really asked Boris Johnson about 4 times, and he wouldn't talk about it. And there were conflicting views about... After that, in fact, Jeremy Hunt, the Johnson people thought that he came as an anticlimax, actually, because people weren't really that interested in him. Johnson was the show, and somehow by managing to stand... So there may be, but I don't think there's very likely to be a row about red wine on a sofa from either Liz or Rishi. But surprises like that can happen. But after that, I think it became rather obvious, didn't it, that Johnson had an unassailable lead. So,
which did make things rather boring.
Which could make these hustings. I mean, if that turns out to be the case, if Truss's lead is confirmed by further sort of polls and things, the hustings could start to seem a little redundant.
Well, it'll be obviously for us personally, it would be quite satisfying because there is to have the Conhome survey continue to greatly frustrate and anger many of the professional pollsters of Britain with its stubborn insistence on being broadly right.
Yes,
despite
unforgivable. Yes,
despite not being.
I would say though the only flaw within that would be, I think, in one of those 2 articles that I wrote when I applied for the job of assistant editor, I had to do a sort of review of who was up and who was down in the cabinet, and I said in that we've passed peak Truss. So alas, I might have your I've inherited your prediction abilities, Andrew, in my short time at Conhome.
Oh, well, I thought for a moment you were about to say there was a flaw in the survey, in which case I would have been bidding goodbye to William Atkinson, former of Conservative Home. So, I mean, we might as well, since we have you, the blonde beast, the man himself, what sort of shadow do you think Boris Johnson is going to cast over this contest? Obviously, he had his last PMQs, where he, like the Terminator, promised to return. What do we think is going to happen with Boris? What impact do we think he's going to have?
I don't know that he'll have a great impact. Or some of his supporters, of course, are very, very angry and blame Rishi for bringing him down. So there will be some sort of die-hard Johnson supporters, I suppose, who are motivated mainly by anger at his treatment. Though I would have thought nothing like as great as after the fall of Thatcher, when there really was. I mean, I remember Nick Budgeon, wonderful Wolverhampton MP, he'd taken over Enoch's old seat, I think. He said that the members in Wolverhampton were very, very angry, and they didn't much mind which beast they used to destroy Heseltine. And in fact, they decided that John Major was a better bet than Douglas Hurd on that occasion. I don't think will there be quite that degree of animosity in this?
I mean, I'd have not expected so, apart from maybe in the personal form of Nadeem Dorries.
Oh yes.
Yes,
no, she.
But if we set her aside in a special category
Yes.
of loyalist, then I think
Yes.
probably the rest of them will be. But we don't expect him to make any interventions or.
You never know what's going to happen, what he's going to do. He does have a tremendous gift for putting himself at the centre of any story, but I would have thought he would be careful not to do anything very direct. But of course, there may be events which he has to cope with as Prime Minister. So,
And indeed, given that he had no choice but to stay on as Prime Minister and couldn't possibly have stepped down to let a deputy take over, he will then be forced by circumstances to respond.
He might well, yes,
to respond to those events,
yes.
Which I'm sure he would find absolutely heartbreaking. But for the good of the nation, he would
certainly do his duty.
Step back into the limelight,
absolutely,
or the jet fighter, or whatever it was that it happened to be at the time.
Absolutely, yes.
What do we think he's going to do? Do we reckon he's
of course,
stay in Parliament?
I rather hope he does. I think it's a bad thing when people just cut and run. And I think it's good that Theresa May has stayed in. I think the House should be given the benefit of his by now quite considerable experience.
Yeah.
But he won't be keen on declaring all his earnings to the commissioner or whoever it is that you have to declare all that stuff to. And his earnings will be absolutely colossal. I mean, he will be able to charge so much for speeches and articles and all the rest of it. And of course, his Shakespeare book will come out. Very good of him to bring this obscure playwright to wider. And he'll
along with little-known statesman Winston Churchill, who's also received.
I don't think he'll want to close down the possibility of coming once more to the party's rescue should the party fall on evil days.
So you don't expect him to sort of strike the compromise position of becoming Baron Johnson of wherever?
I'd be very astonished if he did that.
Yeah.
I think you have to declare pretty much open your bank account to public view, don't you, if you become a member of the House of Lords?
But I think it's just more obscure. I mean, do any of us really know what the Marquis of Montrose, earns?
Well, we're not interested, but people would be very interested in Boris Johnson's.
I suppose that's true.
Although he had it all sorted out years ago when he fought Livingston, and Livingston thought he was going to catch him out. And Boris just published the figures, which were indeed colossal. But it turned out that it was Livingston who had a company which was opaque and was plainly a tax.
Well, this is the thing. I think
minimising his tax.
This is often the case, right? It's usually the hypocrisy more than anything else that does for politicians.
Yes.
I think this is one of the things people underestimate about Rishi.
Yes.
Like Rishi being rich in and of itself isn't the handicap that some people think it is. It's a danger if he's, for example, seen to be either fiddling his taxes or not doing enough on the cost of living.
Yeah.
But back when he was Saint Rishi of Eat Out to Help Out and Labour were running these absurd stories about his £150 coffee mug, no one really cared about that. Right, so what we're going to finish off in the traditional way, having sort of surveyed the week ahead, which I'm sure will furnish us with an absolute smorgasbord of extra news, as the Conservative Party seems to want to do at present. And we're going to go to William for our winners and losers of the week just gone.
I would have to say, Henry, that the winner must be Liz Truss, because if you think back to where we were last week, with her having not a particularly good performance in the first debate, where I think she came last in the polling of the general public, and a lot of people suggested her performance was quite wooden, and I think they paid more attention to the fact that she appeared to be dressed in an outfit that resembled one worn by Mrs. Thatcher, more than they were actually interested in her own performance. But then she came back with a better performance in the second debate. And after a lot of speculation that Kemi Badenoch, which of course Condé surveys showed to be the new darling of the grassroots, overtaking her as the candidate of the right, she eventually finally overhauled Benny Mordaunt in the final ballot, and now looks set to be, if the polling is correct, our next Prime Minister. I think the most recent poll out from YouGov a day or so ago suggested she had 62% support amongst the membership against 38% support for Sunak, suggesting Sunak is about as popular as Brexit was in Scotland. So I think in that sense, Liz Truss has repositioned herself as the new darling of the grassroots, now likely next Prime Minister. And I think she says stuff that the members do want to hear. I think they are fed up of tax rises. I think they are fed up with a government that isn't particularly interested in fighting the culture wars. And because as both International Trade Secretary and Foreign Secretary, and now as well as being Minister of Women and Equalities, Liz Truss has shown a willingness to fight on all those fronts. I think she has positioned herself very well to be the person who wants to stand up for the membership, especially if Rishi Sunak insists on being the man who wants to tell them hard truths. And I think at the moment, especially as all our heads have been scrambled a bit by the events the last couple of weeks, members are more interested in hearing, the old tunes played better, to misquote Penny Mordaunt. And
dare I ask, given the strength of your feeling on this one, dare I ask who had the bad week?
Well, I must say, speaking of Ms. Mordaunt, it's probably Penny Mordaunt who's had the bad week, because I remember when we were sat here last week, we suggested, as you pointed out, that Paul even argued that she would be the person who would be in the final two, along with
Most
Rishi
ungracious
Sunak.
of you to bring that up. I don't know.
No, I would. we will draw a veil over this sort of historic inaccuracy. But yes, but so I think when we were having this discussion a week ago, after she had managed to come top of our poll, after she'd come sort of top of the various different matchups, etc., and after she'd come top in, I think, various public polling, she looked to be set fair. But then, as Andrew pointed out, a combination of a few articles over the weekend, quite a big splash in the Mail, ironically for Ms. Mordaunt, the thing that brought her first to public attention, rather suggested that she was, I think, a bit woker than the general public, or especially the party membership, were ready to have as a Prime Minister. And I think certainly her slightly outrageous comments about it ain't half hot, mum, and things like that, did not necessarily endear her to the party membership. And I think it basically killed her momentum, as long with the comments of people like Lord Frost, etc., who is another darling of the membership. And I think then we had Kemi Badenoch sort of surge into the lead as the public's choice, or as in the Tory public's choice. But I think, unfortunately, she was never going to be able to actually pitch together that correct coalition of MPs that she actually required. And I think Liz Truss benefited from having a second debate to make sure she assured her position as the one only candidate of the right. And I think, as a consequence, it looks like it will be Liz Truss who's going to be our next Prime Minister. But as with our success and predictions so far on this podcast, you aside, Henry, who knows what the next week will bring?
Well, it wouldn't be a Conservative Leadership Party contest if we didn't have the traditional shock upset in some respects. So I'd say for me, I always thought that the Penny Mordaunt, if she had a path to the final two, was simply that the MPs who were anything but Liz would look at Rishi Sunak's second round polling and conclude that there was no point sending through a man who was going to lose, no matter how much they liked him. Now, they clearly didn't end up making that calculation, although it was the third round the final round was quite close. But
I think her campaign team, it must be said, handled a lot of things pretty badly. I don't think they really knew what to do when you started having all these stories about things that people had pulled out from her book. And I think that whole hoo-ha about her views on women, etc., just sort of dogged her throughout the entirety of the few days in which she was a contender. And then I think also when you started to get rumblings that she might appoint, say, Andrea Leadsom as Chancellor and David Davis as Home Secretary, I think various party members and certainly MPs thought, we've seen this rodeo once or twice before and we don't really want to go back to it.
It did rather undermine the clean start thing, but you do have to wonder if Rishi doesn't manage to get this polling back and Liz basically coasts through the next 4 weeks to become Prime Minister, if they'll look back on that decision with some regret. But that, I think, brings us to the end of this week's episode. Thank you, as ever, for joining us. You can get more information from Conservative Home by signing up to our free daily email through the button on the front page of the website. We'll let William get back to scrutinising the week ahead, and Andrew to return to scrivening the next volume of his very readable book on Boris Johnson, who is in fairness an excellent subject. And we will see you all next week. Thank you very much.